the spring of 1475, Charles the Bold had been outside Neuss for months. The Burgundian duke had entered the conflict to support Archbishop Ruprecht of the Palatinate and expand Burgundian influence in the Rhineland. Instead of yielding, Neuss held out through bombardment, repeated assaults, shortages, and a siege that stretched across the winter. But the most dangerous threat to Charles was no longer inside the walls. It was forming somewhere beyond them. Across the Holy Roman Empire, princes, counts, cities, nobles, hired soldiers, and local communities were beginning to move. By late May, a large imperial relief force under Emperor Frederick III had reached the theater. The political and military conditions around Neuss were about to change. That sounds straightforward. An emperor called out his army and marched to war. Except Frederick did not possess an army in the way a centralized monarch might. There was no permanent imperial field force waiting for orders in royal barracks. No single military administration controlled all the soldiers, horses, wagons, weapons, and money that would be needed. Much of that power belonged to other people, to territorial princes, city governments, noble networks, and communities with their own rights, obligations, resources, and interests. So the real question is not simply why Frederick intervened at Neuss. It is how that army came into existence at all. Because the force approaching Charles was not one organization simply enlarged for war. It had to be assembled from many separate political and military systems, each of which had to turn an imperial demand into actual men, equipment, transport, and money. And that process reveals something fundamental about warfare in the late medieval Holy Roman Empire. Its military power was not concentrated at the center. It was distributed across the Reich. The challenge was turning that distribution into force. The easiest mistake to make is to imagine the Holy Roman Empire as a state that had somehow forgotten to build an army. It had not. Military power was everywhere. It was simply not concentrated in one place. A prince might maintain armed retainers at his court, call on vassals for mounted service, or hire additional troops when war required it. A city could organize its defenses, impose military obligations under local law, hire professionals, and send a contingent into the field. Territorial and rural communities could provide armed men, carts, animals, labor, and transport. Across the empire, military capacity existed inside political communities that controlled their own money, manpower, equipment, and institutions. What the emperor lacked was direct ownership of most of those resources. That distinction matters. A centralized ruler with a permanent army can, at least in principle, move forces through a single administrative chain. Frederick III could not simply issue an order to an imperial war ministry and watch regiments march out of barracks. To build a large army, he had to activate resources that were legally and politically embedded in other authorities. The empire had already developed tools for doing this. In 1422, during the struggle against the Hussites, an imperial diet at Nuremberg approved a military register that assigned troop contributions to individual imperial estates. The logic was simple even if its execution was not. Instead of expecting King Sigismund to maintain the entire force himself, the burden was distributed among members of the Reich. That did not create a modern conscription system. It did something more basic. It turned collective defense into an allocation problem. The center could define a military requirement and assign shares of that burden. The constituent powers still had to turn the assessment into actual troops on the ground. This principle would become increasingly important. Imperial warfare could be built from distributed obligations, and those obligations rested on military systems that already existed below the imperial level. Inside a principality, a ruler had his household, officials, vassals, towns, and subjects. Inside a city, a council could draw on taxation, civic duties, stored equipment, contracted soldiers, and transport. Smaller communities could contribute men, animals, wagons, supplies, or labor through the territorial structures above them. None of this meant that every inhabitant of the empire was permanently mobilized. Nor did it mean that every territory organized military service in the same way. The Holy Roman Empire was far too diverse for that. But diversity did not equal absence. It meant that the Reich's military resources were stored in different institutional forms. Men with armor and horses, urban troops and hired professionals, crossbowmen and gunners, wagons, draft animals, tools, cash, and food. Officials who could summon people, collect contributions, organize musters, and coordinate movement. This is why the phrase "no standing army" can be misleading if taken too far. The emperor had no large permanent imperial field army under continuous central control, but he presided over a political order filled with smaller military systems. The problem was conversion. A horse in Saxony did not help Neuss simply because it existed. A militia in a German city was not yet an imperial field force. A nobleman's retainers were still attached first to their own lord. Military capacity only became imperial power when someone could turn these separate resources into a common contribution, move them toward the same theater, and keep enough of them working toward the same objective. And that required more than a legal right to ask. It required politics. Because before Frederick could assemble an army, he first had to get the people who actually controlled its pieces to participate. By 1474, the struggle around Neuss had become more than a local dispute. The conflict had begun inside the Archbishopric of Cologne, where Archbishop Ruprecht of the Palatinate was fighting opponents among the territorial estates. When Ruprecht secured the support of Charles the Bold, however, the balance changed dramatically. Burgundy brought military resources and political ambitions that reached far beyond the internal politics of one archbishopric. Ruprecht's opponents appealed for support. Frederick III responded by trying to turn the crisis into collective imperial action. But an imperial decision was not the same thing as an imperial army. Frederick could issue summonses. He could invoke obligations. He could use his position as emperor to frame Burgundian intervention as a threat requiring a broader response. What he could not do was simply reach into every principality and city and take control of its soldiers. The political structure of the empire stood between the order and the army. Every major territorial ruler still controlled his own resources. City councils controlled theirs. Nobles had their own networks of dependents and vassals. Participation, therefore, had to pass through people whose interests did not always match Frederick's. And not all of them responded in the same way. Some of the most important support came from rulers already closely connected to Frederick's imperial politics. Albrecht Achilles of Brandenburg became one of the most prominent figures in the campaign. The Wettin princes contributed major forces, as did the electors of Mainz and Trier. Other major powers stayed away. The Wittelsbach princes, despite their importance within the empire, did not participate on the same basis. That difference is essential. If an imperial summons automatically produced military service, the political loyalties of individual princes would matter far less. But at Neuss, the emerging army reflected the networks, rivalries, calculations, and alliances of the Reich itself. The emperor was activating a political system, not commanding a military machine from above. This also meant that participation could become self-reinforcing. A smaller ruler or city considering whether to commit men and money faced uncertainty. Would enough others join? Would the campaign really materialize? Would the expense produce anything useful? Sending troops into a failed mobilization could waste enormous resources. But when major princes committed substantial contingents, and when Frederick himself prepared to accompany the army, the calculation changed. The campaign became more credible. More participants meant a greater chance that the army would actually form. And the greater that chance became, the more rational participation could appear to others. On November 21, 1474, Albrecht Achilles wrote to his counselors about the remarkable response to the call against Burgundy. His words conveyed something important. Even a man deeply involved in imperial politics was struck by how widely the mobilization appeared to be spreading. That surprise tells us something about the system. The creation of a Reichsheer was possible. It was not routine. Imperial authority could provide a common objective and a framework for collective action. But the actual force depended on enough political actors deciding that this particular war justified the cost. Legal obligation mattered. So did political loyalty. So did fear of Burgundian expansion, existing alliances, local interests, and confidence that other members of the empire would also participate. None of those factors worked alone. Together, they turned an imperial call into a network of commitments stretching across the Reich. But even that was only the beginning. A prince who promised troops had not yet delivered soldiers to the Rhine. He still had to find the men. He had to determine who was obligated to serve, who could provide equipment, who would furnish horses and wagons, and where additional professionals might have to be hired. He had to organize money, supplies, officers, transport, and a route toward the campaign. And in doing so, he encountered a familiar problem. His own subjects and vassals did not necessarily want to provide everything he requested. The political friction Frederick faced at the imperial level repeated itself inside the territories below him. An imperial demand could therefore pass through several layers of negotiation before it became a soldier standing in a muster field. This was the critical conversion point. Frederick could call for an army, but the princes, cities, nobles, and communities of the empire had to build it. For a territorial prince, Agreeing to the imperial campaign created a new problem. He now had to turn a political commitment into a military contingent. That process began with resources he already controlled or could claim through existing relationships. His household, officials, vassals, towns, landed subjects, and the networks through which soldiers could be hired. But none of these automatically became an army simply because the prince wanted them to. Consider one surviving example from Saxony. In 1474, Jan Puster of Posterstein received a summons from Elector Ernst of Saxony connected with the mobilization against Burgundy. The demand specified resources. Puster was to appear after St. Martin's Day with horses for military service. He was also expected to provide a strong wagon drawn by 4 horses, together with provisions and other campaign equipment, and to report near Leipzig. On paper, this was one small obligation imposed on one local nobleman. In practice, it reveals the machinery underneath princely mobilization. The ruler did not begin by recruiting every soldier personally. He distributed the burden. A noble could be required to provide himself, mounted personnel, animals, equipment, or transport. Officials could organize demands within territorial districts. Towns could be assigned contributions of their own. Subjects with different levels of wealth and status could owe different forms of service. Each obligation converted a small portion of local society into military capacity. And Puster's wagon is as important to understanding this system as the armed men. An army did not consist only of fighters. Every contingent had to move food, tools, equipment, baggage, and supplies. Horses had to be fed. Men had to be provisioned. Routes had to be planned. Equipment had to arrive with the troops rather than weeks behind them. A ruler who promised Frederick hundreds of men was therefore promising far more than hundreds of bodies. He was promising an entire moving support system. That made mobilization expensive. Mounted service was particularly demanding. A man expected to campaign on horseback required weapons, armor, animals, and maintenance. Retainers expected support. Wagons required teams and drivers. Mercenaries demanded wages. And this is where the neat language of imperial assessments met political reality. Princes could pass demands downward. Their subjects could push back. Research on the Neuss mobilization shows that territorial rulers frequently confronted the same problem Frederick faced at the imperial level. Vassals and cities attempted to reduce the contingents demanded from them. That matters because an assessment written on paper was not the same thing as the force that ultimately marched. Between the two stood negotiation. A prince might be told what contribution was expected from his territory. He then had to decide how to divide that burden among the institutions and people beneath him. Those actors had financial limits, privileges, precedents, and arguments about what they actually owed. The result was not a single clean chain of command. It was a chain of conversions. Imperial demand became a princely obligation. The princely obligation became dozens of local demands. Those demands became individual men, horses, wagons, payments, and contracts. Only then could they become a contingent. This also explains why mercenaries were not a separate alternative to the system. They were part of it. If a ruler or community could not produce all the military specialists it needed through obligation, it could purchase capability on the military labor market. Money could become experienced horsemen, infantry, gunners, or other personnel. The empire's military system mixed obligation and contract because its political system contained different forms of authority. Some men came because status or law required service. Others came because they were paid. Some were attached to noble households. Others were mobilized through territorial institutions. What made them part of the same campaign was not that they had been recruited in the same way. It was that their separate recruitment systems eventually pointed toward the same theater. That remained visible even after the troops assembled. Princely contingents were organized around their own rulers. Their officers, followers, and political identities did not disappear when they joined the Reichsheer. A Saxon contingent did not stop being Saxon simply because Frederick III was present. A Brandenburg force still looked toward Albrecht Achilles. The empire was therefore not eliminating decentralization in order to fight. It was packaging decentralized forces into something larger. And that gave the system an unusual characteristic. Mobilization could happen in parallel. While one prince gathered mounted retainers, another could be calling his vassals. A territorial town could be preparing men and wagons. Elsewhere, contracts could be negotiated with hired soldiers. No single central administration had to perform every one of those tasks. Many local administrations were doing them at the same time. That was one source of capacity. it was also a source of friction, because every local conversion depended on different authorities, resources, negotiations, and timetables. The emperor could ask for one Reichsheer. What moved toward the Rhine were many separate armies in miniature. And some of the most sophisticated of those miniature military systems were controlled not by princes, but by cities. Princes were not the only authorities capable of building military contingents. Some of the empire's cities had developed systems of their own. Behind their walls stood governments that could collect money, enforce civic obligations, maintain defenses, store military equipment, hire professionals, organize transport, and place armed men under appointed commanders. In wartime, those institutions could be redirected outward. A city council receiving a demand for military support faced many of the same questions as a territorial prince. How many men could it spare? Who would serve? What equipment would they need? Would the city send its own inhabitants, hire soldiers, or combine the two? How would they be paid? Who would command them? And how could the city protect itself while part of its military capacity was somewhere else? This is why an urban contingent should not be imagined simply as a crowd of citizens grabbing weapons and marching through the gate. The process was administrative. Late medieval towns were already military communities in an important sense. Maintaining local security required organization long before an imperial campaign began. Walls had to be repaired. Gates had to be guarded. Weapons and ammunition had to be acquired. Men had to be identified for defensive duties, and money had to be found to pay for all of it. That existing machinery could become the foundation of field mobilization. When a city chose or was required to contribute to a campaign, it could draw on several different sources of military power. One was its own inhabitants. In many towns, civic status carried military obligations defined by local law, wealth, and custom. Citizens could be expected to maintain equipment or participate in defense. But civic obligation was only one option. Cities also hired soldiers. And this is crucial because it meant urban governments could convert financial resources directly into military manpower. If a council had money but lacked enough suitable troops, it could contract experienced fighters. Militia and mercenary were therefore not always two completely separate military worlds. Both could appear inside the same urban mobilization system. Research on the Neuss campaign shows precisely this mixture. Cities mobilized contingents of their own or hired paid troops to complete them. They also confronted a problem princes understood well. Military command and political control were not the same thing. A professional soldier might understand campaigning better than a counselor. But a city government had powerful reasons not to place an expensive armed contingent completely beyond its political supervision. One solution was a dual command structure. Urban forces in the Neuss mobilization could be led by a militarily experienced captain, sometimes a hired professional, alongside another captain drawn from the city council. The arrangement reveals what the contingent actually was. It was both a military unit and a political investment. One commander helped it function in the field. The other helped ensure that the force continued to represent the government paying for it. Cities could also cooperate through networks larger than themselves. Nuremberg, for example, acted as a political representative for the smaller Franconian imperial cities of Winsheim and Weissenberg during the mobilization. That matters because decentralization did not necessarily mean every political unit operated alone. Smaller members could work through larger regional actors. In effect, networks created another layer of aggregation. A small city might have limited influence at the imperial level. Several cities acting through a powerful regional center could coordinate their interests more effectively. And beneath the city government was another layer of people and material that made deployment possible. A field force required far more than armed citizens. It needed servants, wagoners, craftsmen, food, draft animals, replacement equipment, and cash. Men who never fought in the front rank could still determine whether the contingent reached the battlefield in usable condition. This was another reason cities mattered. Their military value was not limited to how many men they could place in formation. Urban economies could produce, purchase, organize, and move resources. A city was therefore not merely a source of soldiers. It was a conversion mechanism. Money could become wages. Stored equipment could become combat capability. Administrative records could become muster lists. Political authority could become compulsory service. Commercial connections could support supply. And civic institutions designed for local defense could become the foundation of an expeditionary contingent. But every conversion imposed a cost. The men sent away could no longer defend the walls at home. Money spent on mercenaries could not be spent elsewhere. Wagons and animals committed to a campaign disappeared from the local economy for as long as they remained in service. Councils therefore had reasons to bargain over the size and form of their contributions, just as nobles and princes did. Once again, the empire's military strength depended on actors who retained their own interests even while participating in a common war. By the time these urban contingents began moving toward the Rhine, the Reichsheer was becoming something extraordinary. Princes had built their forces through one mixture of obligation, household resources, vassalage, and hiring. Cities had built theirs through another combination of civic institutions, money, local service, political administration, and contracts. They had not been created by the same bureaucracy. They had not been recruited under one set of rules. They did not even arrive under one uniform command structure. Yet they were moving toward the same campaign. The empire had solved the problem of producing military forces without first creating a centralized military state. Now it faced the next problem. How do you turn all those separate forces into one army? By the time the imperial contingents began converging on the Rhine, Frederick III had solved one problem. The empire had produced troops. It had not yet produced a unified army. That distinction becomes clearer when we look at who actually answered the call. Patrick Luckel's preliminary count of the Reichsheer formed in 1474 and 1475 identifies 24 princes, 40 counts, and 72 cities, alongside many lower nobles and other participants. Their forces included vassals summoned through feudal obligations, paid mercenaries, armed citizens, servants, and men raised through territorial institutions. Those figures should not be confused with a precise total for the army's manpower. What they reveal is something more important. The force approaching Neuss was politically heterogeneous on an extraordinary scale. Each major contingent arrived with its own history. It had been recruited through its own institutions. It had been financed through its own arrangements. Its officers had usually been chosen before it reached the imperial camp. Its soldiers often knew their local commanders far better than any figure supposedly standing at the top of the entire Reichsheer. And many had marched to the Rhine beneath the banners of their own prince or city. So when these forces finally occupied the same theater, they did not suddenly become identical pieces of one centralized military organization. They remained contingents. A princely force might contain mounted retainers, vassals, servants, hired professionals, and supporting wagons organized around the household and political network of its ruler. An urban contingent might combine citizens, contracted soldiers, city-appointed commanders, support personnel, and resources purchased from the city's treasury. Other formations could contain different mixtures again. Their equipment varied. Their internal command structures varied. Their financial arrangements varied. Even the reasons their leaders had joined the campaign could vary. What connected them was a shared strategic objective. That was enough to bring them together. It was not enough to erase the institutions that had created them. This is why the Reichsheer is best understood not as a permanent army expanded for war, but as an army made from other armies. The process resembles aggregation more than centralization. First, military resources were assembled locally. Then local resources became territorial or urban contingents. Then those contingents marched toward a common theater. Only after those steps could something recognizably imperial emerge. That sequence matters because it changes what we mean by raising an army. In a more centralized system, the central government might control recruitment, taxation, arsenals, officers, and supply through institutions ultimately responsible to the same authority. At Neuss, many of those functions had already been performed before the contingents ever met. The empire did not replace those local systems. It relied on them. This gave the Reichsheer the ability to draw resources from widely separated parts of the political order. But it also meant that the force carried decentralization with it into the field. The same prince who had negotiated his contribution at home did not abandon his political independence when he entered the camp. The same city council that had paid for a contingent still cared how that contingent was used. The same officers who had commanded men during the march continued to possess authority over them after arrival. Muster therefore solved only one part of the problem. It solved presence. Enough forces could now be placed in roughly the same operational space to change the balance around Neuss. But presence was not integration. Thousands of men can stand in one camp and still represent different authorities, different priorities, different supply systems, and different chains of loyalty. That creates problems a simple headcount cannot capture. Who chooses the route of march? Who decides whether to attack? Who takes the most dangerous position? Whose troops guard the camp? Who has priority when food is scarce? What happens when one contingent wants to move while another wants to wait? And how much authority can any single commander exercise over troops that were neither recruited nor paid by him? These were not abstract constitutional questions. They had immediate military consequences. The larger the Reichsheer became, the more valuable coordination became. But the same growth that increased its military weight also increased the number of relationships that had to be managed. This is the paradox at the center of the campaign. The empire's decentralized structure allowed many military systems to work in parallel. One prince could mobilize while another hired men. One city could prepare wagons while another raised money. No central office had to perform every task. That helps explain how such a politically fragmented order could produce a major collective effort. Yet when those parallel processes finally converged, their independence did not disappear. The system had converted political fragmentation into military mass. Now it had to convert military mass into coordinated action. That was harder, because an army can be assembled without becoming a single machine. And as the Reichsheer gathered near Neuss, the empire encountered the price of fighting without a center. The Reichsheer had become large enough to threaten Charles the Bold. That did not make it easy to use. The problem was built into the same system that had created the army. Every major contingent had arrived with its own leadership, political interests, financial arrangements, and internal loyalties. Those structures had made decentralized mobilization possible. Now they had to coexist inside a common campaign. The first challenge was command. At the beginning of the mobilization, the great princes did not simply fall into a neat hierarchy beneath a single professional commander. They stood alongside one another as powerful political figures in their own right. Frederick III was emperor, but imperial rank did not automatically give him the kind of direct operational control that a modern commander-in-chief might exercise over a national army. The princes commanded forces they had raised. Their contingents were tied to their authority. Their cooperation, therefore, had to be organized politically as well as militarily. Over the course of the campaign, Albrecht Achilles of Brandenburg emerged as one of the most important leadership figures. But even this did not transform the Reichsheer into a centralized army. Leadership could coordinate the contingents, could not erase the authorities behind them. Every important military decision, therefore, existed inside a political environment. A prince had to consider the preservation of his own force. A city cared about the men and money it had committed. The emperor had objectives that were not necessarily identical to those of every participant. And while many had reason to oppose Burgundian intervention, agreement on the enemy did not guarantee agreement on every method, cost, or risk. Then there was the second problem, keeping the army alive. The larger the Reichsheer became, the more impressive it looked on a map. It also became hungrier. Every additional soldier required food. Every horse required fodder. Wagons needed animals, drivers, repairs, and roads. Weapons and ammunition had to move with the army. Money had to continue reaching paid troops. And much of this material had to travel across territories whose economic and legal systems did not suddenly disappear because the emperor was at war. The Rhine and Main offered essential transport routes for supplies, but river transport had a price. Research into the Neuss campaign shows that some imperial estates faced heavy costs because supplies transported along these rivers could still encounter tolls. Boatmen also raised their prices sharply as military demand increased. The logic was simple. A large army created extraordinary demand for transport. Extraordinary demand made transport more valuable. And the more expensive transport became, the more costly it was to sustain the army whose size had created that demand in the first place. Imperial and territorial authorities could sometimes negotiate toll-free movement for supplies. But the need to do so illustrates the problem. The Reichsheer was moving through a political landscape filled with jurisdictions. Military geography and political geography overlapped. A road was not merely a road. A river was not merely a river. Movement could depend on rights, tolls, negotiations, access, and cooperation from authorities along the route. This is where the phrase fragmented empire becomes militarily meaningful. Fragmentation did not simply mean that there were many territories on a map. It meant that the movement of military power could pass through multiple centers of authority, and each could introduce friction. The third problem was time. Distributed mobilization allowed many territories to work simultaneously, but they did not all work at the same speed. One contingent might already be marching while another was still assembling. One city might have secured hired troops while another was still negotiating its contribution. Men could be ready before wagons. Money could be available before transport. An imperial campaign, therefore, did not appear all at once. It accumulated. That was dangerous during a siege. Charles did not need to defeat an army that had not yet arrived. Every week Neuss remained isolated gave Burgundy more time to break the defenses, exhaust the city, or force a political settlement before the collective strength of the Reich could be brought to bear. This was the cost of a system that relied on conversion at multiple levels. The emperor first needed commitments. Princes and cities then had to turn commitments into resources. Resources had to become contingents. Contingents had to travel. And once they arrived, they still had to cooperate. Each stage created delay. Yet the important point is that none of these frictions prevented the system from functioning altogether. They defined the conditions under which it functioned. The Reichsheer did not need every member of the empire. It did not need perfect administrative uniformity. And it did not need to transform every contingent into an identical formation. It needed enough participants, enough resources, enough coordination, and enough time. Once those thresholds were crossed, the mobilization produced something Charles could no longer ignore. This is what makes the military system of the late medieval Reich difficult to describe simply as weak or strong. Its strengths and weaknesses came from many of the same institutions. Local control allowed princes and cities to maintain military capabilities without waiting for an imperial bureaucracy to create them. But local control also meant that the emperor could not use those capabilities without bargaining with their owners. Parallel mobilization spread the administrative burden across the empire, but different timetables slowed convergence. Multiple political centers provided multiple reservoirs of men, money, and equipment. But those same centers complicated command and logistics once the resources came together. The system produced depth. It also produced friction. And this distinction matters when we return to Neuss, because Frederick did not need to turn the Reichsheer into a perfectly integrated military machine. He did not need to prove that the empire could campaign like a centralized monarchy. He needed something more limited and strategically more important. He needed to change Charles the Bold's options. For months, Charles had been able to concentrate on breaking Neuss. Now the situation was changing. The city was still resisting. The imperial contingents were no longer scattered abstractions in letters and registers. They were approaching the battlefield. The political resources of the Reich had become physical military pressure. The question was no longer whether the empire could raise an army. The question was what Charles would do now that the army had arrived. For roughly 10 months, Charles the Bold had tried to solve the problem of Neuss by force. The city had refused to cooperate. Its defenders endured siege works, artillery fire, assaults, shortages, and the steady pressure of a Burgundian army attempting to compel surrender. But by late May 1475, the strategic situation was no longer the one Charles had chosen when he began the siege. Neuss was still holding, and the empire had arrived. That distinction is important because the Reichsheer did not need to storm the Burgundian camp and destroy Charles's army in one spectacular battle for the mobilization to matter. Its presence changed the calculation before such a battle had to occur. For months, Charles had been able to concentrate much of his effort on a fixed objective. The longer Neuss survived, however, the more time Frederick's mobilization system had to work. Imperial calls became territorial demands. Territorial demands became men and money. Men became contingents. Contingents became marches. And eventually those marches placed a large imperial force close enough to alter the military balance around Neuss. This was the moment when administrative processes became strategic power. The defenders of Neuss had already imposed a serious cost on Burgundy simply by refusing to collapse. Every additional week Charles remained outside the city, tied down troops, consumed provisions, and prolonged a campaign embedded in a wider diplomatic and military contest. The Reichsheer introduced another problem. If Charles continued the siege, he now had to reckon with a major relief force while maintaining the siege itself. If he abandoned Neuss, the political objective that had kept him there remained unfulfilled. If he accepted a large battle, he would be gambling against a force whose arrival had already transformed the local balance. The important change was not that Charles suddenly became militarily powerless. He did not. It was that his range of attractive options narrowed. That is what strategic pressure often looks like. It does not always destroy an enemy's capability. Sometimes it makes the enemy's original plan increasingly difficult to sustain. At the end of May, Frederick and Charles reached an agreement under strong diplomatic pressure, including papal mediation. The confrontation did not culminate in the enormous decisive battle that the size of the forces might suggest. Charles did not immediately vanish from the region. His final departure came later in June. That sequence can look anticlimactic if we expect military success to mean annihilating the enemy army. But that expectation misses what the Reichsheer had actually accomplished. Its purpose was not to demonstrate that Frederick III possessed the best centralized army in Europe. He did not. Its immediate strategic function was to help prevent Charles from imposing his preferred outcome at Neuss. On that measure, the mobilization mattered. The city remained unconquered. The Burgundian siege was abandoned, and the imperial intervention had changed the conditions under which Charles could continue the campaign. Nothing about this result erased the weaknesses we have already seen. The Reichsheer had taken time to form. Its contingents had been assembled under different authorities. Its supply system faced substantial friction. Its commanders had political interests of their own, and its existence depended on a degree of participation that contemporaries themselves found remarkable. Those weaknesses were still real, but military systems do not have to eliminate every weakness to produce strategic effect. They have to generate enough usable power in the right place before the opportunity disappears. At Neuss, the Empire crossed that threshold. This is why focusing only on the final number of soldiers can be misleading. The remarkable achievement was not simply that a large body of armed men eventually stood near the Rhine. The achievement was the chain that had made their presence possible. An emperor who controlled no permanent imperial field army had generated a common political demand. Princes translated that demand through their territorial networks. Cities converted money, civic obligations, administration, and contracts into forces of their own. Nobles, subjects, servants, professionals, horses, wagons, and supplies were assembled through many local systems. Those systems operated separately. Then their outputs converged. And once enough of them converged, Charles the Bold was no longer besieging Neuss under the conditions in which he had begun. The system had changed the battlefield by changing the strategic environment around it. That is the real payoff of the campaign. The Holy Roman Empire did not suddenly stop being decentralized in 1475. It demonstrated that decentralization and collective military action were not mutually exclusive. Under sufficient pressure, and with enough political cooperation, its dispersed institutions could generate a force large enough to matter. But Neuss also shows why that ability should never be confused with an automatic imperial war machine. The army existed because a remarkable number of separate systems managed to work toward the same objective at the same time. And when the crisis passed, those systems still belonged to the princes, cities, and communities that had created them. The relief of Neuss did not prove that the Holy Roman Empire had discovered some hidden formula for perfect unity. It proved something more limited and more useful. The empire could generate collective military power without first becoming a centralized state. That capability rested on a political structure very different from a permanent national army. Frederick III did not possess all the soldiers who eventually appeared on the Rhine. He did not personally administer every wagon, horse, weapon, payroll, or supply line. Instead, those resources already existed across the Reich under many different authorities. Princes maintained households, vassal networks, officials, and territorial institutions. Cities controlled money, civic obligations, hired soldiers, and administrative systems of their own. Local communities supplied men, animals, transport, and labor. Mercenary markets allowed money to be converted into additional military capability. The emperor's role was not to replace these systems. It was to activate enough of them. Imperial calls created a common demand. Political networks helped turn that demand into commitments. Princes and cities then translated those commitments into local obligations, contracts, equipment, and money. Those resources became contingents. The contingents marched. And when enough of them converged around Neuss, political cooperation became strategic pressure. That was how an army could exist without a permanent imperial army waiting in advance. But the same explanation also reveals the limits of the system. Because the emperor did not directly own most of the resources, he could not assume that every demand would be fulfilled. Contribution had to be negotiated. Some major actors participated heavily. Others did not. Princes faced resistance from the people beneath them just as Frederick faced uncertainty at the imperial level. Different contingents mobilized at different speeds. Once assembled, they retained different commanders, interests, and chains of loyalty. And the larger the force became, the more difficult it was to feed, move, coordinate, and sustain. The empire's capacity and its friction therefore came from the same source. Distributed authority created distributed military resources. It also prevented those resources from being used automatically. This is why Neuss should not be remembered as the moment the Holy Roman Empire suddenly became a centralized military power. Nothing of the sort happened. When the campaign ended, Brandenburg soldiers remained part of Brandenburg's military-political world. Urban contingents returned to their cities. Mercenary contracts expired. Horses, wagons, and men went back into the political and economic systems that had supplied them. The Reichsheer dissolved because it had always been temporary, but the structures capable of producing collective force remained. That is the deeper meaning of the campaign. The Holy Roman Empire did not keep its military power in one army. It kept that power across a network of political communities. Most of the time, those communities pursued their own interests. Under the right combination of threat, obligation, political cooperation, and time, however, enough of them could be aligned to create something larger than any one participant. Neuss shows what happened when that threshold was crossed. Not perfect unity, not centralization, not a modern state in medieval disguise. A decentralized political system temporarily converting its dispersed resources into collective military force. And that is how the Holy Roman Empire raised an army without a standing army.